Picture this. It's 1588, and you're standing on the docks of Seville watching the most expensive military disaster in human history sail towards certain doom. 130 warships packed with 30,000 men and enough cannons to level a city. The Spanish Armada. The cost? Astronomical. But here's the twisted part. Philip II didn't even have the money. He borrowed it, against silver that hadn't been mined yet, from mountains on the other side of the world. And when those ships sank in the storms off Scotland, the debt didn't sink with them. What kind of empire builds its entire future on wooden boats crossing oceans full of enemies? The kind that confused money with wealth. And Spain was about to learn the difference the hard way. If you want to understand how entire empires can look rich on paper while quietly walking toward economic suicide, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the rest of this story or the modern versions playing out in real time. But before we dive into this economic train wreck, hit that subscribe button. Because if you're going to watch your portfolio implode, you might as well understand the historical precedent for spectacular financial self-destruction. Now everyone knows the story they taught you in school. Spain discovered the New World. Spain found gold. Spain got rich. Spain ruled everything. But that official narrative is missing the most important part. The part where infinite money destroyed the Spanish economy from the inside out. Because here's what they don't tell you about sudden wealth. It's not a blessing, it's a virus. The year is 1545. High in the Andes Mountains of what's now Bolivia, an indigenous man named Diego Gualpa is chasing a llama. He stumbles, grabs a bush to catch his balance, and when the roots pull away from the earth, he sees something that will change the course of world history. Pure silver. Veins of it running through the mountainside like frozen lightning. Welcome to Potosí, the rich hill. And calling it rich is like calling the ocean damp. This wasn't just a mine. The entire mountain was practically solid silver ore, a geological freak that would pump out 80% of the world's silver for the next 2.5 centuries. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. This was their El Dorado. Within decades, Potosí transformed from a desolate wasteland into one of the largest cities on Earth. Bigger than London, bigger than Paris. Perched at 13,000 feet above sea level, where the air was so thin that men gasped for breath just walking down the street. But here's where the miracle becomes a nightmare. To get the silver out, Spain needed labor. Lots of it. So they instituted the Mite system, mandatory conscription of indigenous workers. Tens of thousands of men forced into dark, suffocating tunnels. Week-long shifts without seeing sunlight, carrying heavy sacks of ore up rickety wooden ladders. The locals called it the mountain that eats men. And if you squeezed those famous Spanish silver coins hard enough, they said blood would drip out. The ore was low grade, so Spain developed new technology. Mercury amalgamation. They'd crush the rock, mix it with toxic mercury, and have workers trample it with their bare feet. Revolutionary chemistry that allowed industrial-scale silver extraction never seen before in human history. The output was staggering. Between 1550 and 1800, Mexico and Peru produced 80% of the world's silver. Most of it went straight to Spain. They melted it into bars and minted the piece of 8. The first global currency. Accepted everywhere from Shanghai to Boston, the dollar of the Renaissance. Twice a year, the treasure fleets would gather in Havana. Massive convoys of galleons riding low in the water, weighted down with billions in today's money. When they appeared on the Spanish horizon, church bells rang across the country. The king breathed easier. The bankers rubbed their hands together. The party could continue for another year. Spain became the superpower of Europe overnight. They had the tercios, those feared infantry squares that were undefeated on every battlefield. They built cathedrals dripping with gold leaf. Charles V, and later his son Philip II, believed God had chosen Spain to lead the world. But they made a fatal calculation. They looked at their mountains of silver and said, "We are rich." They didn't realize they were actually planting the seeds of their own economic destruction. They were confusing money with wealth. Money is just paper or metal you trade for things. Wealth is the ability to actually make those things. Food, clothes, tools, ships. Spain had found infinite money, but they were about to stop producing wealth entirely. The silver was acting like a narcotic. Massive, euphoric high, feeling of invincibility. But deep inside the economy, the vital organs were shutting down. Farmers were abandoning their fields. Blacksmiths were putting down their hammers. Why work when the ships are coming? Picture this. You're a shoemaker in Seville in 1550. Seville is the gateway to America, the boomtown of the known world. Suddenly the treasure ships arrive. Sailors pour off the decks with pockets bulging with silver. Nobles have money. Soldiers have money. Everyone wants your shoes. What do? Exactly what any rational businessman does. You raise your prices. Now imagine this happening everywhere at once. The baker raises bread prices. The landlord jacks up rent. The weaver charges more for cloth. This is what historians call the price revolution, the first major inflation crisis in modern history. For centuries, European prices had been flat. A loaf of bread cost the same in 1500 as it did in 1400, but now prices in Spain exploded by 400%. In our world, we panic over 2 or 3% inflation. But medieval Europe had never seen anything like this. It shattered the social contract. The poor got crushed. Wages couldn't keep up. Spanish peasants found that even with more silver in the country than ever before, they could buy less food than their grandfathers. Starvation returned to the countryside. Not because there was no food, because the money was broken. But the rich faced a different paradox, one that would destroy Spanish industry forever. Because inflation made everything in Spain so expensive, Spanish goods became completely uncompetitive in global markets. Our shoemakers' shoes now cost 10 silver coins because leather and food prices had exploded. But a shoemaker in France or England, where the gold rush hadn't hit yet, could make identical shoes for 2 silver coins. So Spanish consumers did the obvious thing. They stopped buying Spanish products. They imported everything from abroad. Spain became a funnel. Silver would arrive in Seville by the ton, and within weeks flow right back out to France, England, the Netherlands, and Italy to pay for imports. Spain was doing all the hard work, enslaving the miners, sailing dangerous oceans, fighting off pirates, only to hand the money over to their economic rivals to buy dinner. A saying emerged from this period. Spain is the mouth that receives the food, chewing it for the rest of Europe. Or as one French observer laughed, everything is expensive in Spain except silver. This economic reality transformed Spanish culture. In England and the Netherlands, the merchant class was rising, building factories and shipyards to sell goods to rich Spaniards. But in Spain, working for a living became seen as shameful. The ideal was the hidalgo. The minor noble who owned land, did no manual labor, and lived off government pensions or rent. Easy money created a society of consumers and bureaucrats. The dream wasn't to start a business. It was to get a government job near the silver pipeline. Spanish literature from this period is full of these characters. Impoverished nobles literally starving to death but refusing to work because it was beneath their dignity. They'd rather polish their armor and pretend to be wealthy than dirty their hands with trade. While the Dutch were inventing stock markets and the English were improving agriculture, Spain was building churches and buying fancy velvet capes. They looked shiny and golden on the outside, adorned with American plunder. But inside they were rotting. No production, no innovation, just waiting for the next fleet. And this created a terrifying vulnerability. The entire empire's stability depended on wooden ships crossing an ocean full of storms and enemies. If the wind didn't blow right, the king couldn't pay his bills. And King Philip II had very large bills. He didn't just want to be rich, he wanted to rule the world. Sitting in his massive, gloomy palace surrounded by monks and mountains of paperwork, Philip controlled Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, the Philippines, and most of the Americas. But holding the planet is expensive. Philip saw himself as God's sword on earth. His divine mission was defending Catholicism against Protestant heretics and Ottoman expansion. This meant fighting everyone everywhere all the time. He battled the Turks in the Mediterranean, fought the French for control of Italy. But his biggest bleeding wound was the Netherlands. The Dutch had rebelled against Spanish rule. Philip sent 70,000 soldiers to crush them. This began the 80 Years' War, a logistical nightmare. To get troops to the Netherlands, Spain had to march them along mountain roads from Italy through the Alps into northern Europe. Paying, feeding, and clothing an army thousands of miles from home for decades. Because Spanish industry had been hollowed out by inflation, they couldn't even make their own weapons. Spain often bought gunpowder and cannons from foreign merchants, sometimes from the Dutch themselves. Potosí silver was literally funding Spain's enemies. Then came the obsession with England. Queen Elizabeth was a Protestant heretic in Philip's eyes. Her privateers, like Francis Drake, kept stealing Spanish treasure ships. In 1588, Philip made the ultimate gamble. The Spanish Armada. 130 ships, 30,000 men, thousands of cannons. The most expensive naval force ever assembled. But here's the insane part. Philip didn't use silver he had. He used silver he hoped to get. Welcome to the dark side of Spanish finance. The asientos. High-interest loans from German and Italian banking families like the Fuggers. Philip was essentially taking out payday loans on an imperial scale, borrowing millions against future treasure fleet arrivals. The bankers charged 10, 20, sometimes 40% interest. The Armada was a disaster, not defeated by superior tactics or firepower, defeated by weather. Storms smashed the Spanish fleet against Scottish and Irish rocks. Half the ships sank. Thousands of sailors drowned. When the news reached Philip, he reportedly said, "I sent my ships to fight men, not the winds and waves of God." But the bankers didn't care about God's winds. They wanted their money. The ships were at the bottom of the ocean. The cannons were rusting in salt water. The investment was gone. But the debt remained, and the interest kept ticking. By the 1570s, interest payments on the national debt were larger than the entire tax revenue of the Spanish Empire. Think about that. Every penny the government collected in taxes plus every ounce of silver from America wasn't enough to pay just the interest. They weren't even touching the principal. Just treading water. Philip was trapped on a financial treadmill, borrowing new money to pay off old money, mortgaging Spain's future for generations. The breaking point came in 1557. Wars had drained the treasury. The treasure fleet was delayed. Bankers refused new loans. Philip stood before his court and issued a royal decree. Spain was suspending all payments to creditors. He looked at the most powerful bankers in Europe and said, I'm not paying you. Financial earthquake. In Antwerp and Genoa, banks collapsed overnight. Wealthy families lost everything. Credit markets froze. The 16th century equivalent of 2008, but caused by one man's decision. But here's the tragedy. Default didn't stop the spending. Spain was addicted to war and imports. They had to keep borrowing. After the crash, bankers eventually came back. But now they charged even higher rates to account for the risk. The debt spiral accelerated. Spain defaulted again in 1575, again in 1596, again in 1607, 1627, and 1647, a generational cycle. Borrow, spend, crash, repeat. The impact was horrific. When the king couldn't pay soldiers, they mutinied. In 1576, unpaid Spanish troops sacked Antwerp, their own city, burning it to the ground. This destroyed Northern Europe's financial center and pushed the Dutch to fight even harder for independence. Since all the silver was flowing to foreign bankers, there was no money left for commerce inside Spain. So the crown began debasing currency. They stopped minting silver coins for the public and started making copper ones called vellon, junk money with no intrinsic value. The king would mint billions of these copper tokens and force people to accept them at silver value. A hidden tax. Predictably, hyperinflation exploded on top of existing silver inflation. Prices fluctuated wildly. People hoarded silver and refused copper. The economy split in two. Rich people and government dealt in silver, while the poor traded worthless copper tokens. The middle class was wiped out. By the mid-1600s, the Spanish century was over. Potacy's mines began running dry. The veins thinned out. But Spain had spent 100 years buying things instead of learning to make things. They had nothing to fall back on. No textile industry like England. No banking sector like the Netherlands. No luxury manufacturing like France. Castilian cities that once bustled with trade emptied out. Populations collapsed. Fields lay fallow. Spain descended into a long, dark sleep of poverty and irrelevance. The empire that owned the world became known as the sick man of Europe. Meanwhile, countries that had absorbed Spain's silver used that capital to invest. England and the Netherlands built merchant fleets, funded scientific research, created stock exchanges. They understood the ultimate economic truth. Wealth isn't metal you dig from the ground. It's the productivity of your people. The Dutch used Spanish silver to build ships that would dominate global trade. The British used Spanish silver to fund the Industrial Revolution. Spain was just the conduit through which American wealth flowed to create the modern world, leaving Spain itself hollowed out and empty. This is the ultimate warning about sudden unearned wealth. Whether it's silver in 1550 or oil today or lottery winnings tomorrow. Easy money breaks the link between work and reward. It creates the illusion of prosperity while rotting the foundation. Spain didn't just find treasure. They found a curse. They thought they were masters of their destiny, but they became slaves to their own fortune. The Spanish Empire teaches us that gold isn't wealth. Gold is a drug. And entire civilizations can overdose. If you want to understand how modern economies are making the exact same mistakes, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started dissecting the spectacular ways that easy money destroys everything it touches. And you really don't want to realize all this only after your own economy has already caught the same disease.